Long ago, longer now than it seems, I made a video stating that I thought the former kingdom of Brook, of which he served as a leader for a battle convoy for, was that of the Muggy Kingdom on Gloom Island, which is the former headquarters of the warlord Dracul Mihawk. However, the reason why I made this claim was because Brooke is most likely based off of Jack Skellington from the movie Nightmare Before Christmas. In said movie, there is an iconic hill with a swirl in it. On Gloom Island, you have very similar hills, these swirling big hills, right? So I was trying to connect one with the other. However, upon further thought and investigation, I think I have come up with something a bit more interesting. So, there is a theme in One Piece in which we don't really talk about the blues all that often. The blue that is most talked about is the East Blue, which is because that's the majority of where our main characters come from. They call them the East Blue Five in some spaces: Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji, right? So the East Blue gets the most of the coverage. However, in other blues, they usually give us, well, most of the time, one or two significant locations for us to chew on as they become relevant to the narrative, right? In the West Blue, we have one such island called God Valley, home to the God Valley incident, in which the Rocks Pirates, the Roger Pirates, and the Marines interrupt the native hunting game of the Holy Knights. So, why is this so interesting? Well, the interesting thing about this island in particular, especially within the framing of which we are shown said island, is that it disappeared without a trace. Now, many think this is because of what happened to the Lulusia Kingdom. Maybe God Valley met the fate of the Mother Flame. I don't think that's necessarily true. But what's also very interesting in the frame of which we are shown this island are the various characters that are on the island. We have Big Mom and Kaido, who are a part of the Rocks Pirates at the time. And we also have a child Bartholomew Kuma. Now, the interesting thing that ties these three together are their interest, or at least their association, with giants. And I just find that very interesting within itself. So we have Kaido and his affiliation with ancient giants. Then we have Big Mom and her fascination with giants and wanting to marry into the royal family of Elbaf so she could claim fame to being Pirate King. Also, thanks to her backstory, we do know that Big Mom grew up on Elbaf amongst giants and was responsible for killing Jor Fallbeard. So that too is something to ponder. And then we have Bartholomew Kuma, whom is a buccaneer. Now, a buccaneer is often speculated to be related to giants in one way or another. Perhaps there are some sort of half giants. And we know now that buccaneers do share a similar religion to giants as they worship Mika. Circling back to Kaido, it's also speculated that in being an Oni, of which Kaido is, he may or may not be related to ancient giants, as there's been a lot of suggesting that ancient giants and Onis have some sort of kinship with one another. Now, going off of that, you know what's interesting about God's Valley disappearance? It's that we've seen islands be used as transportation before, notably Onigashima, via the use of Kaido's fish fruit model Azure Dragon flame clouds, right? It's also very interesting, now that I bring the fruit up, that Kaido gets the ability of that fruit during this incident on God Valley. So, with that being said, it's interesting that he used the powers of that fruit to move the island of Onigashima with it, turning it into a mobile base, right? So I propose the question to you. What if God Valley didn't disappear, but was shaved down significantly and turned into a mobile base? What I'm getting at is, what if God Valley became Thriller Bark? You see, of the various islands in the West Blue, there is only one truly wrapped in mystery, that being God Valley. We do know, thanks to Brook at the end of the Thriller Bark arc, that Thriller Bark originally came from the West Blue. Now, it's very interesting that it's just called the name of the ship. We don't know what Thriller Bark was originally. I think it was the West Blue Island God Valley, because God Valley is the only island that we know of in the West Blue to have disappeared with no explanation. So, much like Onigashima, I think that it was turned into the giant bark known as Thriller Bark at some period in time, because it's very likely that after the event of the God Valley incident, the island itself was left abandoned. As we know, Figler and Garland killed the king during the native hunting game. So, most likely, after everything was said and done, the island could have been pared down from the conflict and changed significantly. This also could have been way after Brook had left, because, as you know, Brook is far older than Roger or Whitebeard and was most likely a pirate when this was going on, because at the time that Brook is in the bar in Sabaody Archipelago before the time skip starts and Roger is mentioned to him, he recalls Roger being a rookie. So, by the time Roger had set sail for the seas, Brook was most likely already a pirate. That being said, with that in place, it's very likely that at some point afterward, Moria or some other party commandeered the island known as God Valley, or the unsanctioned land that was God Valley, and turned it into Thriller Bark. We don't know who exactly built Thriller Bark. That's a question for another time. But I do think this island was most likely used to make Thriller Bark, that being God Valley. Now, the interesting part about Thriller Bark is that it too plays a role into introducing us to a giant. And for the first time, we are actually introduced to what an ancient giant is, thanks to the events of the Thriller Bark arc in the form of ores. So, if the two are connected, that will be the fourth time a giant related character is placed on this island. Furthermore, I think it's very interesting that if Brook was originally from God Valley and served as a leader of a battle convoy for God Valley, that means that he left his homeland, became a pirate, sailed all across the world, only to end up in the Florine Triangle, back to his homeland once again as a reborn being, thanks to his death and rebirth provided by the Revive through, also known as the Yomi Yomi no Mi. And in this way, in a very interesting case of narrative irony, his homeland too has been reborn into a sick, twisted version of itself, now littered with monsters and abominations. So it would be super interesting, if this is true, that Brook went down the same path as his homeland have went down, destroyed by others, only to be brought back as a weird and unsightly representation of what they once were. For Brook, he comes back as a skeleton with an afro, and now God Valley is a gigantic fortress with the original landmass in the center. Now, whether Brook knows that Thriller Bark once was God Valley is unclear, but I do find it interesting that he felt comfortable enough after the events of Thriller Bark were over to bury the remains of his former crewmates on Thriller Bark, saying that, like them, Thriller Bark is originally from the West Blue, which is his home blue. So maybe he does know that Thriller Bark was once God Valley, because it seems so specific and directed and intentional that he would bury the remains of his long lost crewmates on this weird abomination of an island just because it's from the same place that they are from. It's very strange considering how big blues tend to be. That's what makes me think that perhaps he knows that this island was once his home island, God Valley, because it just seems too intentional for me to think otherwise. On top of that, getting back to the topic of Dover users who got their powers during the God Valley incident, we have Bartholomew Kuma, who ate the pawpaw fruit during this incident. What's interesting about this is that we see the pawpaw fruit in action for the first time during the Thriller Bark arc, in which an adult Kuma pays a little visit to Gecko Moria. Now, with that being said, there's a very interesting ability that the pawpaw fruit has. It allows the user to travel to places they have already been. This is even going as far as going to places they have been before they ate the fruit, as after Kuma eats the fruit, he's able to push himself, Giddy, and Ivankov back to his home island of the Sorbet Kingdom, way in the South Blue. Now, with that being said, isn't it interesting that he's able to arrive on Thriller Bark without a boat in sight? That's because he's been to Thriller Bark before. Thriller Bark was God Valley. He ate the fruit on God Valley. So, of course, he can always teleport back to Thriller Bark because he's been there before it was Thriller Bark. And I think that is a very interesting sticking point because there's no suggestion that he's been here before outside of the meeting that he's had with Moria, other than what I'm suggesting in that being that Thriller Bark was originally God Valley. And I think it's very poetic to consider that, much like Brook, where you start is where you end. So, like Brook was born in God Valley and then returns to God Valley as a dead man, essentially, as a reborn being, but still a dead man, Kuma, who got his fruit from the God Valley incident, is now returning to God Valley shortly before his consciousness is deleted. So in both cases, you have this interesting narrative coupling of two men who got a new lease on life, one figuratively and one literally, in this nation of God Valley, only to return to it, both transformed like the island itself, now on death's door or dead. So I find that just interesting within itself. Brook returning to his homeland after he has become a skeleton, Kuma returning to the place that he got his fruit from, now knocking on death's door before he becomes completely subservient to the world government as a mindless weapon. So if all this is true, this is a beautiful narrative use of the location. Another interesting sticking point is that during chapter 1072, Vegapunk has a flashback while Bonnie is observing Kuma's memory bubble. He's thinking back shortly after he gives an explanation of how the pawpaw fruit presumably works, that there was a scholar in the West Blue that discovered that the human body loses 21 grams after death, suggesting that this is the weight of a soul, and souls can be observed since they exist. With that being said, as I've said in the past, I think the scholar that he's referring to is Dr. Hogback, seeing as how he too, much like Brook and Thriller Bark, is from the West Blue. And from what we have been told, he seems to be the most famous doctoral mind out of the West Blue. So, most likely, seeing as how he is a highly respected doctor from the West Blue, despite his perverted acts on Thriller Bark, Vegapunk is most likely talking about him. So, isn't it interesting that Thriller Bark is the arc in which we see the Paw Paw fruit in action, and during Thriller Bark, we are introduced to Dr. Hogback? I think this is a very interesting tie to round things all together. Because no matter where you go, you can't seem to separate Kuma from Thriller Bark. That being said, you can't separate Kuma from the place that he got his fruit from originally, which we are presuming to be once God Valley. But with that being said, I did want to touch upon a theory I heard some years ago. The theory goes that Onigashima was God Valley. I don't think this is true because there's no connection between Onigashima and the West Blue. The reason for this being said, it's because during chapter 982, it is Marco who says, "Oh, that little separate island is called Onigashima now," leading to the thought that it could have been called something different some time ago. And given that he knows Whitebeard, people relate that back to God Valley, seeing as how Whitebeard was a participant in the God Valley incident. It's highly speculated that maybe at some point Onigashima was God Valley. However, like I said, it doesn't make much sense given that there's no tie to the West Blue when talking about Onigashima. I think it's very intentional and very coordinated for Brook to bring up that Thriller Bark is from the West Blue. That information comes to you towards the end of the arc. It's completely unnecessary, but I think it's very intentional. And for the God Valley to be from the same place, I think it's very directed, very intentional, especially seeing as how God Valley is the only island that we know of in the West Blue to just up and vanish, and to become a type of phantom island in a way, sitting in the Florian Triangle, just seems very intentional to me in terms of the narrative. Though I do find it interesting that Onigashima did sink, so it has disappeared like God Valley. That's kind of interesting, but to continue, I will say there is some very interesting parallels between Onigashima and Thriller Bark because one, they presumably once were called something else, and two, they are commandeered by Moria and Kaido respectively. And it's very interesting that Moria and Kaido have a shared history and have both turned these islands into mobile bases, as towards the end of Onigashima, Kaido, using his Flame Cloud abilities, is able to lift the entire island and plans to invade Wano with it. On the flip, somehow, some way, Moria has turned the entirety of the island, presumably God Valley, into a giant bark. So that's interesting within itself. I think that's very intentional. I also think it's very intentional that the first time that we meet an ancient giant is in Thriller Bark. And then, as it's been speculated for years, presumably the skull that sits on top of the island of Onigashima may have belonged to an ancient giant in the past, because as Kaido talks about it, it seems as though the only structure that's technically his is the castle and such within Onigashima's skull. So the skull, for all intents and purposes, as far as we know, is completely organic, which means that perhaps to tie these two together, that skull could have belonged to a member of the Oars clan. Maybe this is our Oars the first, because as you may or may not know, the Oars that we meet in Marineford way later after Thriller Bark is Oars the third. yeah, Little Oars Jr., who's serving under Whitebeard, is Oars the third. So perhaps Oars the second or Oars the first is the skull on the island of Onigashima. And then we have to figure out where the Oars that we meet on Thriller Bark places within the family. But to continue bringing Whitebeard into the mix, it's also an interesting thought that in all three of these cases in relation to Oars, you could have a member of the half giant clan, presumably, because it's been suggested that Whitebeard could be a buccaneer. Then you have Thriller Bark, in which it's visited by a buccaneer in Kuma. And then you have Kaido and Moria, who may or may not be both Onis, as they both are of a similar height and have similar features in that they have horns growing out of their heads. Then, two, they also provide very interesting insight on how Onis tend to be around ancient giants, because in both cases, both of them had very interesting relationships with ancient giants. Kaido's was a bit more friendly than Moria's, as Moria's just was kind of predatory, as he wanted to collect the bias of ancient giants, as he used Oars' corpse as his own personal weapon, and he dealt the death blow to Oars Jr. because he wanted his corpse as well. So that's all very interesting within itself. And with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Politics.